This specific incident happened when I was stationed in Texas as a member of the Air Force. I will not reveal the identity of the basis, but if I provide some of the story's specifics, I'm certain that a large number of people will recognize which one it is. This story happened a few years after I was stationed there. When I first arrived at this base in 2004, along with many other new troops, I was met with a variety of horror stories. One story told me about a crazy man who was hit by a patrol car and fled into the woods next to a storage facility area. Another told me about a little girl who had been visiting her father while the storage area we were working in was being built, which was long before any of our time there. According to the story, the young girl was playing on some of the structures while her father was working, but she died by slipping off the edge at the top of the structure itself. Even though I didn't understand most of the story at the time, it still terrified me. To make things worse, the airman had driven me to the precise location where the alleged story was set, and he would turn off the music and the engine while we sat in silence. He startled me a few times, but nothing ever happened again. About 3 years later, I was supposed to work at that specific location on the base tonight. Keep in mind that I had been going there for years, but by then the storage area had been totally shut down, save for a few small sections that needed to be physically inspected and driven through. Since our regular vehicle was in the shop for repair, my Alpha car partner and I were assigned a cattle truck to conduct this patrol. No, I'm not joking. The shift actually began very shabbily. Since all of the main maintenance staff had gone home for the night, and the only way to enter the area was through 2 enormous separate gates that took ages to open, we decided to do our final check at around 3 o'clock in the morning. I know this part doesn't seem like it's very important to the story right now, but it will eventually tie into it, so let's fast forward a few hours. We were supposed to do 3 random checks of the storage facility that night, and we had already finished 2 of the 3 previous checks without any problems. I was the spotter who used the flashlight to check the locks on each facility as my Alpha drove throughout this check, so we piled in, locked the gates behind us, and continued on our journey. The story of the little girl took place on a road inside the storage area that we called Echo Street. By this point, everything was going well, and we had completed our rounds when Alpha made the last turn down Echo Street. We had been talking a lot during the night, and we were just shooting when I had a strange feeling that something wasn't quite right, but I couldn't identify what it was. We were about halfway down the road when everything became nearly entirely and frighteningly quiet. As we got closer to the structure from my earlier story, everything seemed to go quieter, even the rumble of our cattle truck and the faint sound of the radio playing. I should emphasize that even writing or speaking this part still makes me shudder and makes my eyes water in terror. But as we got closer to the structure itself, I turned to face the window across from it, and out of my left ear I heard a sound that almost made me throw up. It was the sound of someone moaning or groaning in distress, similar to the girl from The Grudge. My blood turns cold as the faint, eerie moan starts to ring inside the truck's cab between the two of us, in between the dark emptiness of the middle seat. I quickly turn to my Alpha and yell, "Dude, cut that out!" My Alpha turns to me with a perplexed expression on his face and starts to take his foot off the accelerator at this point, asking if I'm moving too quickly. I make a pause with my hand and listen for a bit before my partner interrupts and asks what's wrong when I hear the noise again. I abruptly turn off the music without saying anything at first, and then I whisper to him, "Do you hear that?" He stops the truck in confusion and listens intently. For a brief moment or two, it was nearly silent, but then we both heard it. This time, a woman's long, chilling groan that reverberated in my ears like someone trying to strangle someone while they were struggling to breathe. The sound was incredibly terrifying, and the fact that I wasn't the only one who heard it only added to the horrific experience. I started to ask him my first question again, but he abruptly cut me off and asked, What is it that we foolishly waited to see if we could hear it again? With a loud sense of panic in his voice, we could clearly hear and identify the rumble of the truck's rear gates, which made a kind of metal-on-metal clatter, and the diesel engine's characteristic rumble. But in between the two sounds, we heard the groan for the last time. This time it sounded even louder, but this time it seemed to be coming from both inside and outside the truck. My Alpha pulls the vehicle and drives away, hauling our butts off that street faster than I have ever driven on any other street in the whole base, even though we were surrounded by whatever was generating those distressing sounds. He almost flips the truck as we go around a curve, but it doesn't bother us in the least because we had an unspoken agreement that we wanted to leave as soon as possible. When we reached the two gates again, I jumped out as fast as I could, and my Alpha watched my back as I opened both gates. He then jumped back into the driver's seat and sped out, waiting for me to close both gates as well. When we finally met with our flight chief, we expected him to assume that we were both exhausted and that we had just imagined the whole thing. However, I can still clearly recall him telling us, "I completely believe you." I had something similar happen to me twice, once in that same location and the other in that building behind you. Although we had heard that grudge-like wail, I realize it sounds so corny. But it really did happen, and every time I tell it, it still makes me cry with fear. I only returned to that storage area once after that, but I never went down that road again, and I never went after dark. I haven't shared my story with many people outside of my wife and a few close friends, but I still remember it. It happened when I was stationed in the Army as a radio operator during the Vietnam War, and I was a young recruit just drafted out of high school, and I had no idea what I was getting into or what it was all for. I knew that I had a duty to my fellow servicemen. We arrived on a Friday night, and we were loaded onto numerous buses to be transported to our barracks. The air was extremely humid, and the soil was soaking wet from a recent storm. I can still clearly recall the drive and how it smelled like sewer. While receiving bass instruction, even though my first night was quiet and serene, we could all feel the tension as our drill sergeants frightened us with stories. I remember the half-moon always peeking out from over my head. All of us were gathered around making jokes about the clouds. Being more of a technical guy with little sense of humor, I just listened. In order for everyone to be informed of what was going on everywhere else, it was my duty to supervise communications between my unit and the rest of our personnel. A close-knit team that had just lost its communications operator to a landmine was the one to which I was assigned right away. Along with a ton of other supplies and equipment, I also carried a box on my back the size of radio devices in those days. It was the loudest sound I had ever heard, I remember, the first time we made contact with the enemy. Even though we couldn't see the enemy since we were in a deep part of the forest, we ducked as soon as they began shooting at us and fired back in their approximate direction. We most likely grabbed fire since the mayhem appeared to last forever. 3 dead Viet Cong troops were lying in a pool of their own blood as we moved forward a few minutes later to secure the area and close in on the enemy. This was the first time I had ever seen the enemy up close. It seemed unbelievable to me that I was looking at 3 people who had just been living a short while before. Before we came, they were probably simply spending time with their parents, siblings, and other relatives. Now, we are looking at their dead corpses. But because they were the enemy and would have been standing over our corpses, I have to confess that I felt justified. We were sent to another area a few days later, which had more victims and needed more assistance. After seeing several young guys die in agony and becoming used to the brutality, my NCO told me one day that someone wanted to speak with me. I was met by an elderly man in his late 50s who appeared completely out of place. His demeanor was calculating and premeditated, and even my commanding officer appeared to have changed his mind in front of him. He introduced himself as Rock Douglas, an intelligence officer stationed nearby, and said that I would be assigned to him as an RTO for his unit. I liked my unit and wanted to stay with them, but orders are orders, so I had no choice but to board the Huey and follow him. We arrived at a heavily forested area next to a few Viet Cong huts. The area was heavily fortified by the enemy, and I could definitely imagine the fight that must have taken place there. There were some guys wearing gas masks and other people standing nearby, but they didn't seem to notice me or even care that I was there. It was an odd atmosphere that didn't feel quite right. I even attempted to speak with some of these guys, but all I got was a strange, emotionless glare that made me feel really uneasy. These guys didn't act like regular soldiers, and they certainly didn't have the look of fear in their eyes like most of us did. When I went into one of the smaller huts with Officer Douglas, I was told to wait for someone to come get me. I should have just waited there, but I was too nervous and curious to relax, so I just walked outside to the main tent and took a look inside. What I saw made my stomach drop like it had never done before. On a makeshift table, there were 6 murky containers, each containing a guerrilla fighter's severed head, with several tubes and wires sticking out of them. A green liquid appeared to be reacting with the heads, as their mouths and eyes were trembling as if they were half human. I was in triage a day later with multiple broken ribs and a fractured collarbone, and I never saw Officer Frederick Douglass or those soldiers again during my time there, if that was even his real name. I often wonder what those guys were doing back there. Maybe they were trying to gather intelligence from dead enemy soldiers or something, but it was a strange experience that I'll never forget. All names in the story will be changed, and all locations will be left out. Intelligence Officer Douglas was the one who suddenly grabbed me by the shoulder, and he looked very upset. I politely asked him what they were doing inside, and he angrily replied that we must have been attacked or something. In the middle of the night, our armored vehicle slammed off the gravel road and crashed into the dense undergrowth. The Bravo squad had been silent for weeks, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. An unlikely sign of life from our long-lost companions, the distress signal had previously exploded through our lines like a puff of smoke on a windy day. But the substance of their message, a cryptic series of repeated numbers, haunted me more than their sudden reappearance. "Are you sure, Sergeant Davis, that this is the place I asked about over the static hiss of the radio that shattered the silence that had descended over our team?" Command confirmed. "Get ready." According to Davis, we started into the unknown as our automobile came to a halt, and the dense fog seemed to become heavier. The buildings looked like hollowed-out husks with windows and shattered doors, and the deserted base was becoming quieter. A community that had been bustling just a few weeks before was now a ghost town. Davis called out to us to be alert as we moved forward, our boots crunching on broken glass and rubble. All around were the signs of a conflict. The furniture, bloody rags, and strewn ammunition littering the floor provided a picture of the chaos that had just broken out at the facility. The center of the activity became suddenly strangely silent, but for the faint echoes in the distance and our own feeble breaths. As we approached the command center, the scream of the numbers was transmitted with increasing intensity. In my mind, a constant chant appeared to echo, its meaning as mysterious as the shadows in the surrounding mist. The command center was empty as we walked in. The air was stale. The only light was from the blinking consoles. The radio speakers were crackling with static, and the sequence was repeated over and again in a monotonous voice. 85248-352. In a whisper, Corporal Lee said, "What does it mean?" As she scanned the room, I saw that her eyes were wide. According to Davis, the head of the battalion, Commander H. Haskins, had vanished with his crew. In the hopes of discovering a clue or a survivor, we kept scouring the barren facility, but everything changed in the lab. The air was heavy with the stench of chemicals and decay. Broken vials and overturned equipment were signs that activity had abruptly stopped. A jar hung off its hinges as if forced open. And then we saw the bodies of Bravo unit members, or what was left of them, spread across the floor, their faces twisted in horrified expressions. The motive of the slaughter remained unclear, and their skeletons showed no traces of fighting or gunshot wounds. A mound of study notes and hurriedly abandoned experiments encircled Commander Haskins's corpse, which lay in a corner of the room. Lee pointed to this area and showed a notebook in a rigid, dead hand, with the digits 72856 scrawled across it in unsteady handwriting, followed by the terrifying words, "They're coming for us." The realization hit us like a blow to the gut. The loneliness, the eerie stillness broken only by that infinite stream of numbers, and the ramifications of his statements spun into a million questions with no solutions. That's when the reality of our situation hit us. Who was pursuing them? Was this discomfort not a sign of hope, but a warning? We, the rescuers, became the next victims. Panic set in as the base seemed to be closing in on us. The fog appeared to be becoming deeper outside, so we had no choice but to flee, stumbling through it. The digits continued to reverberate in my mind like a chant that seemed to pursue us, aided by the distant light from our automobile. The automobile was coming when a shadow emerged, whispering through the fog. As the weird figure in the gloom approached us, I felt a chill that was colder than death itself. We had to go immediately, but Davis's yell drew me back to the here and now, and I could feel the terror in his voice. As we got into the automobile, we had no idea what we were up against, even though our training had prepared us to handle a broad range of foes. Lee ran the communications, his hands shaking and his voice shaking. She called for help, but as the radio crackled the numbers, she stopped. "This is Alpha Unit calling Command Mayday. We need immediate extraction from Zone Bravo," she said. 85264. The person who emerged from the fog's shadows vanished along with the base, but the terror it awoke remained as we dashed into an unknown future, and I couldn't shake the feeling that those numbers had some relevance to what we had fallen into. Davis broke the silence by saying, "We can't let this end here. We need to find out what those numbers mean and what happened to Bravo Unit. The only thing I wanted was to learn these things too. I believed that we owed it to them, and when the first rays of light appeared through the shadows, I was struck with a sense of grim resolve. With just a string of numbers and the eerie memory of what we had seen, the actual war seemed like it was just beginning, even though we had made it through the night. I'm convinced that everyone from my unit, including myself, is haunted by the mystery of those figures and the horrors of what may have happened to Bravo Unit. The crimes committed at that site were but one part of a far larger and more horrific tale than any of us could have ever imagined.